This is Inside PHLCouncil, bringing you the latest news from Philadelphia City Council, straight from the source. Inside PHLCouncil is hosted by Joe Grace and Patty Gillett.
Welcome back to Inside PHLCouncil, the podcast brought to you by Philadelphia City Council and its communications team. Now, like so many other things, the coronavirus pandemic interrupted our podcast in March when City Hall closed for public health reasons.
But the business of council hasn't slowed down. Council continued to meet remotely and passed a greatly revised budget in June that reflects the significant economic damage caused to the city by COVID-19 and the reduced tax revenues and emergency expenditures that came with the pandemic.
So when council came back into session, still remote, on September 10th, we knew we could put our heads together and figure out a way to bring Inside PHA Council back to our listeners again.
So here we are. It's good to be back on the podcast. Let's get to the news from Council's first meeting of the fall session, which happened last week.
Patty, Council, it looked to me like Council picked up where it left off on the important issue of police reform in its first meeting since June, as 3 reform measures move forward. Tell us what happened.
Well, first, a residency requirement ordinance that requires all applicants for civil service, including the police force, to be residents of the city for at least 1 year before hiring became law when Mayor Kenney returned the bill to council without signing it. That's an interesting quirk of the law. The mayor has 3 options with a bill from council. He can veto it, he can sign it, or he can return it to council without signing it, after which I think it's 10 days, it just becomes law.
So a little bit of a signal when a mayor does that, and we both know it's somewhat rare. Mm-hmm. They don't feel strongly enough to veto it, mm-hmm. but they sure don't necessarily support it.
Yeah.
So they can let it come back without signature and it becomes law. It's interesting when that happens.
Exactly. The residency reform, which was introduced by Council President Clark with Majority Leader Sherelle Parker, is designed to promote more diversity in hiring by the police department so that the force looks more like the people it is sworn to protect, as Councilmember Parker said. Next up, a bill offered this spring by Councilmember Kenyatta Johnson that would ban the use of certain chokeholds by the police as a matter of city law received an amendment, and that positions this bill, which is dubbed the Let Philly Breathe bill, positions it for final passage this week. The amendment added a definition for serious bodily injury that is now consistent with state law.
Good.
Finally, legislation from Councilmember Gilmore Richardson that would require public hearings before any changes are made to the city's contract with the Fraternal Order of Police received an amendment, and that also sets the bill up for final passage. The amendment clarified that the reform pertains to the city's main contract with the FOP and spelled out the process by which the mayor must notify council of the contract status.
I actually think that's a significant reform. Mm-hmm. It will be interesting to see if there's any debate on that as it comes up for final passage. So it sounds like the topics of policing and reform are going to stay on top of council's agenda all year. Let me take a quick crack at the next update, which is around poverty. So in early March, council and the Kenney administration, with business and nonprofit leaders, they unveiled the results of a year's worth of work, and they outlined a poverty action plan for Philadelphia. The city has more than 400,000 people living in poverty. That's the highest rate of any big city in the country. 2 weeks later, the coronavirus pandemic descended upon Philadelphia and the country, and it sort of froze the work for a moment in its tracks. But as Council President Clark and other council leaders made clear for the last 6 months, Philadelphia can't go back to the old normal once this pandemic lifts. We need a new normal. We need more affordable housing. We need healthier food, access to health care, job training, and we need so much more. So last week, Councilmember Maria Cunha-Sanchez, a key architect of all this anti-poverty work, introduced a budget transfer ordinance at President Clark's request. This bill transfers $10 million from council's budget into the city general fund. Here's the intent of the bill. Quote, to support a grant to the Philadelphia Poverty Action Fund upon the establishment of the fund as a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing programs and services that demonstrably reduce poverty. Councilmember Cunha-Sanchez is working with Council President Clark, the various co-chairs of the Poverty Action Plan, business and nonprofit leaders to lay the groundwork for the next step the establishment of this fund. So we had action on police reform and poverty in the first session. What else did council take on, Patty?
They're keeping the spotlight on gun violence, which is greatly needed. Philadelphia has over 300 homicides, 2,300 shooting incidents, and nearly 1,400 shooting victims in 2020. All of those numbers are 30% higher, and in some cases significantly higher than last year in 2019. And this is mirroring trends that we're seeing across the country. Not just cities, rural areas are seeing a spike in gun violence. Almost immediately after a lot of these areas came out of lockdown, coronavirus, pandemic lockdown, we saw these numbers kind of explode all over the country.
It's right that you add some national perspective here. Go on, sorry.
No problem. And what we're also seeing is that young people are often caught in the crossfire. The number of victims under 18 is also sharply up. So council members took 2 actions last week on this public health epidemic. Council member Curtis Jones, who is chair of council's Public Safety Committee, announced plans to hold hearings that will examine the last 100 shooting incidents in Philadelphia. And that list would certainly include some of the children under the age of 18 who have been shot and killed.
And it should.
Jones wants to drill down on where the guns are coming from, as well as who the shooters and the victims were and their prior contacts with the city's criminal justice system. In addition, Councilmember Jamie Gauthier is urging Mayor Kenney to declare a state of emergency in Philadelphia around gun violence and to direct more resources to neighborhood violence reduction strategies.
Patty, the gun violence, the statistics, the stories, they're grim, they're inescapable. The city has to get a handle on this epidemic. You're right to point out the national perspective, but we're in Philadelphia, and that's what we care about the most, particularly involving our young people. Let's do a little rapid fire update on a couple other things that came up in council. I'll take a first shot. 2 council members stepped up to address how the coronavirus is impacting ordinary Philadelphians. At-large council members Helen Gim and Kendra Brooks introduced measures to extend a city moratorium on tenant evictions by landlords until December 31st. That's in keeping with recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and also another measure to require more paid leave for workers suffering from COVID-19. Then the paid sick leave bill offered by Councilmember Brooks would expand current city sick leave law to include workers in the city not covered by federal sick leave legislation. The bill covers so-called gig workers, like those working for Uber, Grubhub, and other apps like that, and gives workers access to sick leave immediately rather than requiring them to accrue it over time. Another significant change. Now, we both heard there was some back and forth among members over Brooks's legislation and how it would interact with the city's existing paid sick leave law. But council agreed that the Kenney administration would write regulations to clarify very, very clearly the new ordinance's intent and reach.
That's very in keeping with Councilmember Brooks's focus on workers, and we've seen this in other cities as well, and other states where the states have moved to reach out to cover workers who are not otherwise covered by their corporate paid leave policies. That's especially gig workers in the so-called gig economy. We both know the state of Pennsylvania is probably not going to fill that gap anytime soon, so it's up to Philadelphia to step up for these gig workers.
She deserves credit for this intriguing legislation.
Mm-hmm. So Councilmember Parker introduced legislation last week that would make a 911 call a hate crime when it can be demonstrated that there is a racist or ethnic animus underlying the call. The bill is in response to incidents across the country where white complainants have called 911 operators and accused black citizens of criminal behavior where none exists. There have been many incidents of this nationwide, too many to list, but I think the most high-profile incident of this was the birdwatcher in Central Park. And that video went viral, and I think you remember that. It might have been March or early April.
If you saw that, you almost don't even need to read a bill or a news article or anything. The video was just so graphic.
And then Councilmember Gilmore Richardson introduced a resolution calling on the Philadelphia Postmaster to meet with Congressman Dwight Evans and the Philadelphia Congressional Delegation to discuss the alleged removal of sorting machines from Philadelphia post offices, which could cause delays in the processing of census forms and mail-in ballots in this November's general election.
We are going to hear a lot more about this. We know we are in the next 7 weeks on the topics of mail-in voting and voting more broadly, voter suppression. We all know Pennsylvania is a battleground in this election. We're not electioneering at all on this call, but we're going to hear a lot more about the process of voting and is the city ready for it. So kudos to the councilwoman. Real quickly, Councilmember Parker introduced a separate resolution declaring the week of September 14th as Census Week in Philadelphia. Now, the country only has until September 30th for residents to complete their census forms and get them back into the federal government. Council members all put masks on at the start of last week's session to highlight the urgent need to do this and fill out the census. Every resident who's not counted in Philadelphia, Patty, could cost the city $21,000 in federal funds that we'll never get, that we could use for public education or health care or healthier food or roads and infrastructure. So really important to get counted.
Absolutely. The URL to go to complete your census online, if you have not done it yet, is 2020census.gov. And like Joe said, that's $21,000 per person who is not counted. And that is, it's crucial for a city, particularly with, as you mentioned, such a large percentage of our population living in poverty.
Absolutely.
The census takes about 10 minutes to complete online, but it is going to have an impact in Philadelphia for the next 10 years. So that's 10 minutes well spent.
Please get counted.
The next meeting of City Council is scheduled to take place on Thursday, September 17th at 10 a.m. The meeting will be held remotely on Microsoft Teams due to the ongoing pandemic, but will air live on Xfinity Channel 64 and Fios Channel 40, as well as stream live at phlcouncil.com/watch. And I just want to interject here just to thank them, because I don't think we have publicly thanked the fact our team behind the scenes inside PHL Council that is allowing us to continue to have these hearings held virtually. And there's a lot of people, we can't list them all, but there's the Channel 64 team upstairs. There's a lot of tech staff here in Council that have been working since March to make sure that we can stream these hearings live so that people can see what Council is doing even through the pandemic.
So important to say that, and I have two last really quick things, but we don't have a guest this week, so we're going on a little bit further today. One, echoing what Patty just said, so many people working behind the scenes to do this, and when we do the council meetings or the council hearings, but particularly the meetings, we got 17 people, elected officials, that need to be on there for their voice to be heard. They represent 1.5 million Philadelphians, so it's not just like a press conference with one public official and maybe one other person speaking. It's 17 elected officials. It's an extraordinary amount of work, and they so deserve credit. I'm really glad that Patty highlighted the work of the council's support and IT teams. And my last comment is just that I'm so glad that we're back, because we really have high hopes to build this Inside PHL Council podcast. We were well on the way in March when a worldwide pandemic hit us. So we're going to be careful. We're going to socially distance, which really means Patty has to think through how we do it and bring guests back to you, but we're going to do it safely, and we're going to bring this podcast back to you on a regular basis.
Absolutely. And actually, we don't have a guest this week because we're still working out the kinks on how we're going to do that remotely. But our plan definitely is to have a guest next week to talk about really the consequences of the epidemic on Philadelphia, and specifically Philadelphia's finances. So we're looking forward to that, having that discussion. But thank you for staying with us, and we're happy that you can continue to join us inside PHL Council.
Thanks, Patty.
Thanks, Joe.
Visit our website, phlcouncil.com, where you can subscribe to this show, get contact information for each council office, learn more about our legislation, and find dates for upcoming hearings and meetings. Follow us on social media. We're PHL Council on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you enjoyed this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Inside PHL Council is produced by Philadelphia City Council. This episode is adjourned to the call of the next upload. Thanks for listening.